presentation of a part of my research as part of my PhD, and the title is Between the Oniric and the Political Dimensions of Landscape Transformation in Bafra's Tourist Strip. On April 25, 2003, Turkish Cypriot leader Rauf Denktaş opened checkpoints along the Green Line, the de facto border that, since the Turkish invasion of 74, divides Cyprus into an occupied by Turkey north and a controlled by the Republic of Cyprus south. For the first time after 3 decades, Cypriots and others could cross to the other side of an island that is torn by war. The opening of checkpoints has turned the division line into an ambiguous border, with both a political boundary that allows encounters with the ethnic other, either the Turkish or the Greek Cypriot, and a gateway to rapidly developing commercial landscape tourism in the north. This political and commercial welcome overlapped in an exemplary manner on Bafra's Bay, the flagship landscape of a Turkish Cypriot tourism. Since the early 2000s, the bay was transformed into a tourist landscape of hotel casino resorts that absorbed large-scale capital investments of Turkish developers and entrepreneurs, heavily sponsored by the Turkish state. Before becoming a multi-million-dollar tourism zone, Bafra's Bay was home to Greek Cypriots who were violently displaced by the Turkish military during the 1974 invasion. With the checkpoints open after 2003, Samit Turgay, CEO of the first and most iconic casino resort that was built on the strip, the Kaya Artemis Resort and Casino, said that, and I quote, they extended their brotherly hand to the Greek Cypriots and that they would enjoy hosting them at Kaya Artemis Resort and Casino for both meeting and holiday purposes. This was posted in newspaper Haberler in 2007. Considering that these statements were made 3 years after the failure of the UN-sponsored solution to the Cyprus problem, and in lack of a visible political alternative in the horizon, the message was rather clear, that political differences could be evened out if the two sides were given the opportunity and the shared space to meet and indulge in leisure and consumption practices. Turgay tied the commercial spaces of his resort as sites where a broader process of political rapprochement enabled by the opening of the checkpoints could take place. After initial fears that crossing the Green Line would mean recognition of the so-called state of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, after these initial fears were dismissed, the checkpoints posed as an opportunity for a political hospitality on the level of civilians and outside the purview of the state, a process of rapprochement that could foreground, many hoped, a future political solution on the level of civil society in light of the impasse on the level of state politics. As Adam Ramadan shows for the context of the 2006 Israel and Hezbollah war, the conduct of hospitality, even if it's in its most ethical form that speaks to the personal encounters of individuals, is never a selfless act of giving, but often becomes geopolitically instrumental and potentially useful in resolution of conflicts. This builds on the position that the geopolitical is not only the output of state politics, but is also produced in everyday life as second-tier geopolitics, performed by ordinary people and through the little things. It is therefore important to consider sociality, the role of the individual, and the scale of the body as relevant in the production of the geopolitical. This points to the importance of the performance of displaced Cypriots who become peculiar visitors to the other side in their own home. But if the performing body is considered as an important site for an investigation of the geopolitical, then space and materiality cannot be understood as external to these human performances. There is a material substance in relations of hospitality that interacts directly with the individual. Hospitality as a social practice is grounded in objects, landscapes, and material boundaries in houses, in thresholds, and furniture. Similarly, Dittmer's study of political assemblages highlights the role of non-human material flows, of objects that is, in becoming diplomatic material, an active agent in the making of diplomacy. This presentation contributes to this line of thought by studying the geopolitics of hospitality in Bafra's Bay as embodied and performative, and more crucially, as being influenced by the material qualities and the design of space. The area that I'm focusing on today was named Vokolida. It's a coastal forest in the southeast coast of Cyprus, and it was recognized as early as 1961 as a site of exceptional beauty by a French mission of experts that were invited by the first government of the Republic of Cyprus to offer technical assistance for tourism development. That was a time when Cyprus came out of British colonialism and invested much in tourism as a key part of the state's development program. The French mission embarked in a photographic documentation of the island. Images depicted the Mediterranean texture of Okolida's coastal forest, untouched by development, as a quintessential representation of a leisure counter space envisioned by European urbanites and equally by intellectual circles of a non-ascetic European left. All of this credited leisure as the theoretical site for a critique of modernity. These included debates advanced by a number of architects during the 60s and 70s who contemplated leisure as a critique of modernist modes of habitation in the context of an emerging postmodern reaction. In these debates of the 1960s and early 70s, the pre-urban and non-urban specification of the beach, these are terms used by Henri Raymond, were potential sites for an urban revolution. The spaces of leisure held the potential of a more democratic and egalitarian society, where social inequalities, distorted bodily rhythms, and unfamiliar modernist landscapes would be restored by a different mode of habitation that had enjoyment, or jouissance, as it is used in many of these discourses, as its program. Such representations of the beach were mobilized in the social uprisings of 1968, and they were condensed in the slogan "Sous le pavé la plage." The beach under the pavements signified an offensive against the paternalism of the modern city, a cry against urban alienation. The French experts' gaze on Vokolida, as it was documented in their extensive photographic exercise of 1961 and subsequently included in their 1962 study that was offered to the Republic of Cyprus, connected the site with this continental imagination. After all, the leader of the French mission, Eugène Baudouin, was a central figure in these debates, as he held leadership positions in academia and public service at a time when leisure was at the center of disciplinary debates. In his submitted study to the government of Cyprus, he writes, and I quote, "Whatever their social class, most tourists today have the same aspirations, to exchange the setting of a mechanical civilization for the snow-covered slopes or shores where the song of the cicadas alone rises above the lapping of the sea, to discover new lands, to get into the life of their inhabitants, to share their traditional food, their wines, their occupations, and festivities." The study incorporated these rather imported ideas with images of the Cypriot countryside as a backdrop. The mission's photographic lens was focused on what they later conceptualized in their study as the island's major tourist asset. That was its unspoiled nature landscape, leaving the existing towns of the island largely uncommented. Vokolida was featured in the mission sequences of photos as an exemplary case of this asset, and you see some of these, which were offered by the Cyprus Cultural Foundation, the Bank of Cyprus Cultural Foundation. That this need of escape from a mechanical civilization was out of place for the rural and underdeveloped Cyprus of 1962 was not an issue, because the envisioned tourist development promoted by the cooptation of this revolutionary rhetoric was destined to emancipate the European urbanite and not the Cypriot post-colonial subject. Prone to accusations of a neocolonial gaze, this representation of the landscape as unspoiled, despite the team's proclaimed sensitivity to the locale and to the democratic characteristics of the beach, was intended to serve as a pretext for the site's potential for capitalist development. Notably, the representation of Vokolida's unspoiled nature excluded the inhabitants of that landscape from the photographic frame. Thus, the unspoiled was depicted as a natural landscape devoid of human presence, simply in anticipation of development. During Baudouin's presidency of the Union Internationale des Architectes, the topic of leisure and the design of its facilities was indeed regarded as part of French urbanism and planning on every scale of the territory, neighborhood, city, agglomeration, and region. And this was exactly the ethos and the end goal of the 1962 of the 1962 study that the mission produced for Cyprus. In contrast, the photographic albums of Greek Cypriots who inhabited the land until 1974 were telling a different story. In these photographs, the beach stands as a representation of a life before the civil turmoil of the 1960s and before the 1974 invasion. Vokolida Beach is depicted in these photographs not as devoid of human presence, but as a vibrant landscape of enjoyment in the sense that Henri Lefebvre has theorized it, as a site for the development of meaningful social relations where families, friends, and neighbors gather to celebrate, a space of use value in honor of the festival that offered the opportunity of unalienated leisure outside the mode of production. The site of Agia Thekla Chapel, situated at the northeastern point of the bay, was one such site of social enjoyment. Before the violent events of 1974, the waterfront of Agia Thekla was visited regularly by locals who enjoyed fishing and by expats or locals who were drawn to the site for its religious function. On September 24th of every year, when Agia Thekla is celebrated in the Orthodox calendar, the chapel and its surrounding waterfront area would be transformed into a site of a community-wide celebration with the liturgy at the chapel as the main event. Agia Thekla was credited with a number of miracles in the religious tradition. One of these tales concerns the healing of a heavily ill expat who returned to his motherland and prayed in the chapel. Other tales want Agia Thekla to be a mediator for the salvaging of the village's agricultural production in times of severe drought. In such periods, Andreas Tsangaris recalled, a resident of Vokolida, a displaced resident of Vokolida, recalled in our interview that the residents of the village, led by the priest and the chanters, would perform a procession that began at the village's church of St. George, you can see it on the upper left side, and ended at the chapel of Agia Thekla, which is on the coast here. A route that passed through the forest and culminated in the coastal side of the chapel. At the chapel, the congregation would offer a plea to Agia Thekla asking for rain. It is believed that after the prayer, clouds began to form, and the much-awaited rain would begin to precipitate. With the end of the liturgy, the congregation would gather at the auxiliary structures that were situated next to the chapel, comprised by a few guest rooms and a kitchen, where coffee and shade from the sun was offered, was offering space for the community to come together in celebration. Andreas Tsangaris described the buildings around the chapel with the word archontariki, which refers to guest houses of a monastery or religious institution. These religious traditions, deeply engraved in the collective identity of the displaced residents of Vokolida, are inextricably tied with the landscape and its materiality, to the extent that the landscape itself was considered sanctified as a site of pilgrimage and even as miraculous. It is believed that the water spring adjacent to the old chapel is a source of holy water with healing properties. The Turkish invasion of 1974 violently disrupted these practices. Vokolida's residents, all Greek Cypriots, were forced by the Turkish military to leave their homes and flee to the south. The village was repopulated by Turkish settlers, a colonial practice of Turkey to change the demographic consistency of the island's north, and the area was renamed to Bafra. The site remained inaccessible to its displaced inhabitants for 3 decades, and they became refugees in their own country. 3 decades after the events of 1974, the opening of the checkpoints in 2003 enabled the former residents and other Christian pilgrims to visit their village and the chapel for religious functions. Claims of return to this, quote, ancestral land are deeply ideologized and mobilized in the political discourse as part of the Republic's political ammunition. In this rhetoric, however, space remains an abstract concept, a land that is understood as political territory. This territory is claimed under a juridical understanding of the right to space as a dispute over sovereignty. For the displaced residents of Vokolida, however, the spatial practices of visitation to their village after 2003 were a cry and demand, to paraphrase Lefebvre, for a different kind of right, a right to enjoy space. The hordes of people who were patiently lining up for hours at the checkpoints 2003 with the hope to cross the green line were craving a reconnection with the material and sensorial landscapes of their pre-74 life, such as Vokolida's beach and the chapel of Agia Thekla. They were interested in, and I quote from Dimitrius' paper, seeing one's old home, collecting photos that the new homeowners had kept throughout the years, collecting soil from one's fields and fruit from one's garden, visiting one's former village church and cemeteries. It was a cry and demand for reclaiming the landscape as a lived space, as a site for the everyday, where the two communities can perhaps coexist once again in the future, as opposed to a concept upon which rival political claims are structured. According to Andreas Tsangaris, the trips of refugees to Vokolida offer a solid ground for the re-establishment of friendship with their ethnic other. I visit often, and I quote part of our interview here, a part of Tsangaris' narration. I visit often and I have friends there. I'm very close with the mayor of the nearby village of Galatia. At my village, I have excellent relationships with the settlers who came from Trabzon. Whenever I visit, they run to embrace me and extend their hospitality to me. When I ask for help for any matter, they offer it to me. We keep in touch through Facebook. We call each other to exchange wishes for the new year and so on. Even the Hoja of my village, who is a Turkish settler, when we visit the village for liturgy at the church, he runs to help me with preparations, to unload things from my car and so on. I was invited and I attended Turkish weddings at my village, Vukolida. We approach them in good faith, expecting them to look at us in a similar manner. They help us with cleaning the church before liturgy. Tsangaris considers these forms of hospitality as contributing to the project of rapprochement, in contrast to hotel casino tourism, to which a section of the Greek Cypriot society participated after the opening of the checkpoints. Tsangaris continues, in the hotel, one can encounter tourists, people from third countries. These people are not locals. The people with whom I want to establish friendships to mitigate the tension between the two communities and help towards the reunification of the island are not to be found in the hotels, they're outside. It can be inferred from the analysis of Dimitriou and the committees, and very explicitly from Tsangaris, that rapprochement, conceived as an ethico-political form of hospitality, is conflicted by commercial hospitality offered by the casino resorts. This clash was felt vividly at the site of St. Thekla's Chapel. The process of tourist development found the century-old chapel of Agia Thekla right outside the perimeter of the land that was leased in 2006 to the Turkish firm Exen Tourism for the construction of Noah's Ark Deluxe Hotel and Spa, or in Turkish, New Gemizi Hotel. Even though the chapel remained outside the parcel's perimeter, and you can see the delineation of the parcels in the upright, the top corner, and with a black dot is the location of the chapel. Even though the chapel remained outside the parcel's perimeter, it was too impacted by the process of erasure that prepared the ground for construction. During the construction of the hotel, the chapel was demolished by mistake of the bulldozer operator, as the contractor claimed. Recognizing the importance of fostering exchanges for pilgrimage in sustaining a favorable image of the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus internationally, the Turkish Cypriot administration publicly condemned the demolition of the chapel. Turkish Cypriot Prime Minister Irsen Küçük attempted to steer the issue away from the sensitive bicommunal politics, relegating it to a matter that would be resolved within the provisions of the law. The Prime Minister's office announced that the chapel would be reconstructed, and I quote, similar to its original structure, end quote, and that a legal procedure was launched against those responsible for the destruction. Despite the TRNCs, TRNC is a short abbreviation for the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. It's the puppet state that exists in the north, a so-called state, if you like. So despite the TRNC's efforts to tone down the event, the demolition of the chapel did not escape politicization by the Republic of Cyprus. Greek Cypriot EU representative Antigone Papadopoulou presented the issue to the European Parliament as part of a, I quote, string of acts of provocation, end quote, by the Turkish occupying authorities, which breached fundamental rights and freedom of religion. Hagia Thekla's destruction, Papadopoulou asserted, is and I quote again, a regular occurrence having been carried out in other churches, such as St. Catherine's in Gerani, St. Dimitris Church in Ayalusis, and St. Avakum Church in Rizokárpaszon. End of quote. The European Commission was not interested in giving the matter geopolitical value as it was desired by the Cyprus representation. The response of the Commission to Papadopoulou's inquiry was to downplay the event as a domestic matter which could be and was being handled by the Turkish Cypriot administration. For the Turkish Cypriots, however, the political importance of this event was not to be downplayed. The chapel's demolition sparked criticisms on the hegemonic actions of the Turkish power bloc in Cyprus. Kemal Güler-Khan, chairman of youth branches of the left-wing political party Birleşik Kıbrıs Partisi, the United Cyprus Party, argued that the demolition of the chapel must be seen in parallel to the ambitious mosque construction program that was underway, which included the construction of a mosque in Thermia in the same plot and next to a 14th century church. These strategies of erasure and redevelopment were part of Turkey's ruling party, Just and Development Party, of its agenda, which aimed to a systematic propagation of political Islam in Cyprus through the production of space. Mosque construction and the demolition of the chapel in favor of casino construction were part of this. Such spatial practices were similar to domestic process of urbanization in Turkey, by which state-led construction of mosques and commercial complexes, and the two often combined in very peculiar and curious ways, were instrumentalized in the efforts of political Islam to become state ideology. The aesthetic alienation of the landscape through the chapel's demolition was not only a discount from a special historical artifact, as it was seen from a historian's perspective. Rather, the disrespect to history, as Daily Kıbrıs, the largest in circulation newspaper in the north, stated, understood Turkey's treatment of religious sites would burden the future of a potential reunited Cyprus. It will reproduce and perpetuate forms of estrangement between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. Resat Akar, director of Kıbrıs Media Group, wrote, and I quote from his article, "They destroyed Hagia Thekla Chapel, which had a 200-year-long history, because they will create the Noah's Ark. All patriots can celebrate now. We destroyed another historical monument of the Greek Cypriots. Could it be a bigger joy than this?" Referring to the Thermia Mosque, "Go and build a mosque next to a church. If a day comes when the bell of the church starts to ring again, put 4 microphones to overbear it. For goodness sake, could such things happen? We left many mosques in the south. No one saw or heard that a church has been built next to any of them. Then why we consider the other's culture as having no importance?" As a response to these critiques of Turkish Cypriots who still envision a reunification of the island, right-wing nationalist propaganda further spread separatist ideas in the Turkish Cypriot community. Responding to the attention given to the demolition in the press, Turkish Cypriot daily Volkan published on its front page a list with mosques and other religious buildings that have purportedly been destroyed by Greek Cypriots during the period 1958 and 74. The political implications of the destruction of the chapel by the Turkish developers of Noah's Ark Casino were not only a future concern. Rather, the impact of this action had immediate effect on the fragile practice of rapprochement. With pressures from the side of the Republic of Cyprus, and perhaps more intensely from the Turkish Cypriots, the internal to the TRNC outcry for the destruction pressured the administration to reconstruct the chapel on the same site, but only a few meters away from its original position. This is the reconstructed chapel in a quite derelict state right now. The deconstruction did not follow the original, as promised, but provided instead a concrete and brick structure, similar in size, but different to the original vaulted chapel. Upon completion of the reconstruction by the company, any access to it from the main road was cut off, as it was surrounded by an intricate system of tall fences. Initially, access was possible only by the sea. When the displaced Greek Cypriots and other civil society organizations filed petitions demanding access to the site, the fencing was redesigned to allow access from the land, but the inhospitality against the practice of pilgrimage was not restored. An access point was eventually created, but proper access from the road was never restored. The design characteristics of reconstruction were of no concern to the official narrative. Yet these aesthetic qualities that define the embodied experience of the landscape were enough to compromise the fragile process of trust building between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. The aesthetic properties of the site's reconstruction appeared as a hostile gesture that did not restore the social space of pilgrimage, which is crucial for the spatial practices of rapprochement. Rather, they enclosed the new chapel in a network of tall fences that inhibited access. Moreover, the proximity of the hotel, you can see that in the backdrop, to the chapel remained problematic and hostile, contradicting the political hospitality offered to the Greek Cypriots at the checkpoints. According to Tsangaris, visitations were constantly monitored by the hotel security personnel, who made clear that pilgrimage was not welcome. Prayer at the chapel was forbidden, and I quote this from Tsangaris, not from the occupying regime, but from the hotel security. Tsangaris continues, during an organized trip for a liturgy at the village's church, St. George, we decided to visit the chapel of Agia Thekla. We parked our buses on the main road and walked towards the chapel. We wanted to take a video of our visit. I never pointed the camera to the hotel, but the hotel security saw me holding a camera. I soon heard people shouting at me from the main road, telling me to return to the buses because the security was coming our way. The security officer demanded to know what I was recording, and I responded that I was taking some shots of the chapel. He asked me to show him the footage. Meanwhile, more security staff had arrived. I showed him my recording, and he confirmed that I had not turned the camera to the hotel. He then said that we must leave the site. Recently, they have added more fencing. It became even more difficult to access the chapel. One must walk a kilometer down the main road, walk to the waterfront, and then walk on the rocks to finally find the chapel. For some elderly people, this is very difficult. On the contrary, at the Church of St. George in the village, we have no such problems. We have unimpeded access. The construction of Noah's Ark Resort, which opened its doors in 2011, entailed an even broader alienation of the landscape, the complete erasure of the coastal forest, and the extensive curation of an artificial landscape of gardens that served the historical theming of Noah's Ark. The ship-like resort was conceived as floating in a dense Edenic landscape of palm trees and other exotic species, and punctuated by pools and Balinese huts, an iconography that replicated the saturated yet marketable image of the resort. This treatment of the landscape dictated a specific aesthetic standardization that reflected luxury, it appealed to the tourist, and polished the brand of the investors. In doing so, it alienated space to a degree that Cyprus and Vokolida in particular became part of a homogeneous South, no longer regarded as a specific place, but as Lovgren puts it, merely a designation of a kind of holidays. The alienation of the area through a repopulation of the village with Turkish settlers was completed by the aesthetic alienation of the indigenous landscape by a repopulation of its ecology with exotic plant species. These are some images of the resort, empty of people because they were taken during COVID. The dirt road connecting the village through the coastal forest to the chapel of Agia Thekla. Waiting for the map to show up. Give me 1 second. It's a bit stuck. Here it is. The dirt road connecting the village through the coastal forest to the chapel of Agia Thekla, once traversed by the community's religious processions, was now overwritten by an extensive artificial and privatized landscape of exotic gardens, huts, and pools. Similar erasures took place in other enclaves along the bay. Board member of Concord Hotels and Resorts, a hotel that is to the south side of the bay, Erkan Yakci, took pride on his company's innovative landscape design. He says, another prominent feature in the landscape diversity we have integrated with our Another prominent feature is the landscape diversity we have integrated with our 200 plant species that we have brought from abroad. By integrating these natural features, we reflect the service standard we provide, and we will bring a new breadth to Cyprus and its tourism. This was stated in Hurriyet in 2018. The tourist enclaves, as a concluding paragraph, the tourist enclaves replaced the endemic coastal forest with artificial gardens and lawns, appropriating the beach beyond their designated parcels. If this enclosure did not happen through extensive fencing, as it was the case of Agia Thekla, it manifested through soft design techniques, which restrict and often completely cut off access to parts of the beach. The extensive design of gardens, lawns, the construction of piers that extend the logic of land subdivision in the water, the dense array of umbrellas and cabanas on the sand, and the network of gardens and pathways that connect the hotels with the waterfront are such design techniques that attempt to incorporate the entire bay into an expansive privatized enclave, which excludes all those who do not participate in consumption. The aesthetic alienation of the landscape, as it is manifested in processes of erasure and redesign, has contributed to the perpetuation of divisive nationalist resurgence and of inflammatory discourses that sustain division in Cyprus. As the construction of the zone advanced during the 2 decades after the opening of the checkpoint, the occupation of the beach eroded its familiar and sanctified characteristics, turning it into a Turkified landscape. This was the term used by Turkish Cypriot Tuncer Pakistan, former deputy director of the Antiquities Department, who commented on the demolition of the chapel in Daily Yeni Duzen. And equally, the same term was used by Greek Cypriot Antigone Papadopoulou in our interview. The case of Agia Thekla demonstrates that spatial transformation is instrumentalized in the colonial practices of Turkey in Cyprus. The commodification of Voukolidas's coastal landscape constitutes colonial practice, not in the metaphorical sense of capitalism's tendency to dominate everyday life, but in a literal sense, as a process of political domination over territory through the production of space. And thank you.